Okay, so this is part 4 of the Tekno EB48 SL build series. So basically the whole front end is assembled with, of course, the exception of the shocks. This, I think from the last video, this covers about 2.5 parts bags. I'm still on bag K, which some of the parts you use to start mounting the gearbox onto the main chassis, so I'll get to that later. But just as far as the front assembly goes, I put the steering rack together, and the front arms, the front anti-roll bar, the universals, everything. Most of it went together almost exactly the same as the rear. One thing about the turnbuckles, in the last video I mentioned how difficult it is to thread the ball cups into the turnbuckle. A friend of mine who has built 4 Tekno kits mentioned to me that with the ball cups, it helps a lot if you ream out slightly the outside of the ball cup to help thread it in, and to also use a little bit of the black grease on the thread, and that actually does make it quite a bit easier to thread the ball cups. Now it would be nice if the manual told you that as a little bit of a tip for putting these together, but you just have to kind of figure that out yourself. If you just try to do it dry, like what I did with the rear turnbuckles, it's really hard. But with the black grease and a little bit of reaming, it makes it quite a bit easier. One thing to note about the build, okay, so there are 2 things here. First is when you mount the front camber link onto the inside mounting hole on the shock tower, basically there's this screw that you use to mount through the front shock tower, through one of the many adjustment holes, and then you mount it through this ball stud, and then you put a lock nut on the other end. The manual tells you to use 2 spacers. Sorry, let me move this around. It tells you to use 2 spacers on the front of this screw, basically to pull the end of this screw back so that the steering rack can clear the screw as it's throwing, because it comes really close to the end of the screw there. It turns out you actually need to use 4 spacers to pull it back enough to get clearance. Now luckily the kit does include 4 extra spacers, 2 for each side, and basically in that parts bag, I think it's parts bag I, and included effectively 4 spacers that the manual did not tell you to use, plus 2 other screws, these button head screws, that were nowhere in the parts bag I part of the manual. So I'm not exactly sure why those were included. Maybe they're part of the short course build or something. I don't know, because a lot of this goes in the 410.3 short course truck. So maybe that's part of that. I really have no clue. But luckily they do give you some extra washers, which you actually do need to use to pull the screw back a little bit more to clear the steering rack. Now, when you're putting together the steering rack, as well as mounting the camber link onto the outside hole here, you end up basically putting a nut, the same kind of a lock nut, into this open plastic region here. So there's basically 2 mounting holes, and then the plastic opening is sort of hex shaped so that the lock nut can kind of slot in there. And the same thing here with the Ackerman plate. There's 3 mounting holes, and the lock nut's supposed to be able to just kind of fit in there. The problem is for these 2 holes, when you put the lock nut in, the plastic itself is not either the right shape, or it's not strong enough to actually hold the lock nut in while you tighten down the screw. So you have to do a bit of gymnastics with pliers to kind of get in there and sort of squeeze the lock nut down or hold it somehow while you tighten the screw in from the other end, both again for here and for the Ackerman plate. If you don't do that, then the screw ends up being a little bit loose. It's not fully tightened, and you get all kinds of slop. Especially for the steering rack. For the outside camber link, it's not really an issue if this screw is a little bit loose, if it's not fully tightened down on the lock nut, because there's no extra slop that you'll induce on the camber link here. But it will move forward and backward quite a bit if you don't lock it down properly. So you just have to get a set of pliers and kind of get in there and hold it down. So that's a bit of a pain. Other than that, the build went together pretty nicely. The steering rack is smooth. the suspension moves smoothly. There's no real binding in the parts. Again, though, you do have to bore out the inside hinge pin mounting holes for this in the suspension arms, just as you do for the rear suspension arms. But yeah, other than that, pretty smoothly. Well, the build has gone pretty smoothly so far. So I have the front assembly done and the rear assembly done, and basically the next set of steps is to mount it onto the main chassis, and then do the shocks, and then mount the different plates and things for the electronics, mount the electronics, and then we're basically done. So not much left to this build. I plan on making a video probably after building the shocks. I want to see how that goes, because all of this stuff here mounting to the chassis should be pretty straightforward. Yeah, okay, so that's it for now, and I'll probably make a video after the shocks are done. And in the meantime, thanks for watching.